presenters will answer your questions during the Q&A portion. At this time, I would like to introduce Heather Meeker, Silicon Valley co-managing shareholder and chair of the IP/IT Licensing and Transaction Group. Heather, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start just with, well, a brief introduction of myself and my co-presenter, Michael. As was mentioned, I'm the chair of the IP/IT Licensing and Transactions Group here at Greenberg Traurig. We do technology transactions of all kinds. I personally have been working in the open source area for quite an embarrassing number of years now, and it is more and more of my practice all the time. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Michael Herzog, who is the CEO of nexB. nexB has been in business for a while. It's probably best known for its software provenance analysis. Some of you may have run into the company in connection with that work, but it has done other things as well. It's recently launched an offering called DejaCode Enterprise, which is a central business system for managing software assets, including products, open source, and third-party components. When we did a similar presentation about a year ago, I think it had not been launched yet, or it had just maybe been launched. So now, if you haven't looked at it in the meantime, you really should take a look. It's much more robust and interesting now. Michael has over 25 years of experience in enterprise software industry. He had roles at KPMG, Oracle, and Walker Interactive, and he graduated from Harvard with a degree in German language, showing that all of us who are liberal arts majors can actually work in the tech industry. And I forgive him for going to Harvard because I went to Yale. Okay, so I'm going to start. And I'm going to talk just for a few minutes and give us sort of an introduction about open source licensing, concepts, rules, considerations. And then we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty. And Michael is going to go into some more depth about supply chains and how to manage open source in supply chains. I'll just say at the outset that this issue has become an extremely important one because much of the enforcement of open source software ends up having to do with supply chain issues. And those of you who have been involved in open source compliance already know that managing it within the supply chain can be a bit of a challenge. So we're going to talk about that in detail today. All right. So just quickly, what we're going to do. We're going to identify some of the most common open source license obligations. We're going to explain how to comply with them. We're going to discuss some of the key compliance challenges and open source software supply chain trends. Michael's going to talk about a new tool for basic compliance automation, and then we'll have questions. We'll try to leave ample time for questions at the end. If you're on the webinar, there's a way to virtually raise your hand and answer a question. And Pierre, who is a co-founder of nexB, is going to be monitoring the questions and helping us answer questions. So please do ask questions even if you're on the webinar. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the most common open source license obligations. Just to step back for a moment, open source licenses grant you the ability to practice all the rights of copyright that relate to software. They do, however, impose certain conditions, and that's what we're calling obligations here. Those conditions can range from the very simple to the very complex, and obviously we spend a lot more time talking about the complex ones, but in a supply chain, even the simple ones can be a bit of a challenge. So first we have copyright notices, and by that we mean literally a copyright notice. Copyright 2013 ABC Company The requirement to put that on software is part of the conditions of most open source licenses. We also have license notices, which is something slightly different. That is a notice that explains to the recipient the license terms under which the software is offered, at least by the original author. So that usually includes a copy of a license rather than merely a copyright notice. Most open source licenses require both. There are also some things that are usually called attribution requirements. Those go beyond these two initial kinds of notice requirements, and they are relatively uncommon because they've mostly been deprecated by the open source community. The Apache 1.0 license was famous for having such a requirement, which is why Apache 1.1 was released many years ago. Also, the OpenSSL license is a commonly used license that has such a thing. And attribution requirements are not standard in any way. They can range from you have to put this statement in your marketing materials to if you mention the features of this software, you must put this in all copies or in your marketing materials or in your user documentation, etc. Obviously, these can be challenging because many of the licenses have been around for a long time, in which time the way we distribute software has changed a lot. So if there's an attribution requirement that says you must put this in the user manual, it might be very unclear what that means at this point in time. Next, we get to the more meaty obligations or requirements, the copyleft requirements and licensing of derivative works. So copyleft essentially says if you distribute software in binary form, you must make the source code available, and if you distribute it, you must make it available under the exact same license terms. Copyleft licenses include GPL, LGPL, Mozilla, Eclipse, and all the other licenses that are sometimes called reciprocal or viral licenses. Probably most accurate to call them copyleft. And those include source code licensing and source code delivery. The delivery obligation is you usually have a choice between delivering it up front or making an offer to deliver it later. GPL, importantly, also requires build and installation instructions to be delivered. This is an area that is probably not as much recognized by people who have some knowledge of GPL. However, enforcement activities have been focusing on it. Some licenses have additional requirements, such as giving notice of changes that you have made to the software when you distribute it. GPL has that, Mozilla has that, a variety of others do as well. Some have some requirements for indemnifying the original licensor who gave it to you, most particularly if you offer warranties or do anything with the software that causes them liability. And finally, many of them have provisions that say you can't use the trademark of the licensor in particular ways. I would describe the last one as probably more accurately saying the license doesn't grant you any right to use the trademark. Okay, now we're going to talk about notices and how to comply with them. When we talk about supply chains, this is a big issue. So we have a variety of requirements. At a minimum, every open source license requires that you deliver notices. Now, when you have a product that has hundreds of components, that can be a big challenge because a product could not have a user interface, for instance, or it could have a very small, hard-to-read user interface. So if you think about application software, it's relatively easy. Most application software, you can just deliver a notice file that's in the download package. That's relatively straightforward. It can just be a text file. But think for a moment about your cell phone, and the open source notices are on there. I assure you that any cell phone has open source on it and has notices somewhere, maybe harder or easier to find. But think about having to read those on a little tiny screen when you've got some licenses that are 8 pages long, like the GPL is. And now think about embedded software that is in things like automobiles and so forth. Very difficult and challenging to deliver notices in those, or perhaps expensive to deliver notices in those circumstances. For those licenses that are copyleft and require you to make source code available, as I said, you usually have a choice between delivering it when you deliver the binaries up front or making an offer to deliver it later. One of the reasons why it is attractive to deliver it up front, first of all, you don't have to worry about somebody asking for it later and by some mistake not getting it, and therefore you're being out of compliance with the license. But secondly, the notices, the source code has notices baked in for the most part, and so it makes notices easier to deliver. If you're delivering binaries and not source, and you're making an offer to provide source code later, then what you have to do is create a notice file for your binary. And when you look at your phone and so forth, that's what you're seeing is a notice file that the product distributor has created. That's an administrative task to do, and we're going to talk about that more in detail. And obviously can be a lot of work if you have a product with many licenses involved. I should point out, because my clients ask me this all the time, can't I just put a link with that has a link to the license, and can't that be a sufficient notice? And unfortunately, the answer for the most part is no, that doesn't work. The reason for that is that most of the open source licenses were actually written before the web, and so they do not assume that everybody has online access. The idea is that when you deliver the binary with the license notice, it's supposed to inform the user that the user has certain rights to at least pieces of the product that you're delivering. And to know the license terms, the user has to have a copy. Well, back in 1991, when the GPL version 2 was written, there was, it was not a correct assumption that everybody had access to an online version. And so the notices require that you actually deliver a copy of the license with the product. And so that means you can't just deliver a link in most cases. And then very importantly, we'll talk about this more, so I won't touch on it much here, but relying on third-party notices is not sufficient. As I mentioned, the copyleft licenses usually require that source materials be made available but not necessarily delivered with the binary product. And they don't require that you post materials on the web either, but a lot of distributors take this option because it deflects claims, it makes it easier for people to get copies of the source code when they want it, and the distributor has the obligation to provide the source code anyway, so it's just making sure that people really do have access. That means they don't have to then write to the distributor, ask for it, and potentially have a disconnect happen where the source code doesn't get delivered and then the distributor is in violation of the license. It's important to understand that most of the copyleft, well, GPL and LGPL in particular, they can't be changed to other terms. So if you have, let's say you have some proprietary code in your product and you're using an LGPL library, you actually must pass through the licensing terms to that LGPL code directly to the recipient. You cannot, it is not a sub-licensing model. So you have to then have a sort of bifurcated license where your proprietary product is under an end-user license and the LGPL code is under its own license. And so in order to be compliant, you usually have to tweak your end-user license to pass through the copyleft licensing terms. Some of the other copyleft licenses, like Mozilla, allow you to license binaries on whatever terms you like, but you have to make the source code available under the copyleft license, so it might require a little less tweaking. For GPL, of course, that has to be passed through as well, but because GPL has to kind of live in its own executable process without any proprietary code and vice versa, the pass-through of terms is not as straightforward as it might be with LGPL. The point is that for GPL and LGPL, you cannot change a licensing term, so you may actually have to change your licensing terms in order to comply. Some key compliance challenges. You have to, if you're going to comply with open source licenses, you have to know which open source licenses you're using. Tracking what you're using is it's probably the major cost associated with using open source in a business. I mean, you've heard people talk about total cost of ownership. Well, open source doesn't have any license fees, but you have to have an infrastructure in place to track what you're using so you can comply with the licenses, and that's an internal cost that really has to be taken into account. A lot of organizations find that they haven't done this properly, and then they have to backtrack, and that is a lot of time and resources to do. They usually then find that they have to do some re-engineering in order to comply with the licenses. So you have to know what you're using. You have to be able to create your notices if you're delivering binaries and deliver them to your customers. You have to figure out how you're going to do that. Again, pretty straightforward if you're talking about application software, but what about the transmission of a car? How do you inform people about those licenses for the software that goes in the transmission, and how are you going to actually deliver those licenses? I think most of us probably realize this, but putting notices on paper is probably the most expensive way you can do it, which is why the industry has been moving away from paper and user manuals. And yet, if you get a car today and you look at the back of your end-user manual, there are probably GPL notices in there. So it can be quite costly and difficult. Yes, a question.
Who has to be notified? If I'm the owner of a car, do I have to know that there's this open source software in my transmission, or does the automobile manufacturer need to know?
Well, so a company that is selling a product has to notify all people to whom it is delivering the product. So let us say I was manufacturing a car. I have to say that I don't know enough about that business to probably know in detail the answer, but I'm probably selling it to a dealer, and so technically my obligation may be to tell the dealer, but then the dealer will have the obligation to tell the end recipient. It's all recipients. The question is who has the obligation to do it, and when you're talking about a sales channel, in that kind of situation it might not be quite so clear because it might depend on how title transfers, but in a sort of a more normal sales channel, I'm creating a product, I'm selling it at Best Buy. You know, probably I need to put the notices in and let the end user know, because the Best Buy is only a redistributor, and I have to make sure that I'm going to be following the end user license, the open source licenses, or else I'm going to get tagged with an enforcement. Finally, and here's a lot of what we're talking about today, it's important to get the open source data from your suppliers and get it to the customer.
And I think to that point,
Yeah.
wasn't way back when they had the BusyBox suit, and Best Buy sold a lot of products, but they were only sued for the ones, their home product.
Right.
So Best Buy sells a lot of things, just like, you know, just got a new router, it has a piece of paper
Yeah.
in it. But they also made some products under their own brand, I think called Insignia. And they hadn't followed the rules on that, so they were sued individually for that, because that was a Best Buy branded product, not a, you know,
Yeah.
Microsoft product.
I think technically any distributor could be sued, because they could either be sued for direct or indirect copyright infringement, and the claims for the breach of the license actually are copyright infringement claims. But if you were only a redistributor, you might have defenses vis-a-vis the fact that you didn't know what was in the product because you were merely acting as a redistributor, and you might not be found indirectly liable. So that's why it's easier for the plaintiffs to go and sue the manufacturer. Okay, very briefly before I end here, there was a case that came down very recently, I think it was last month, Fantech, there has been a lot of enforcement of GPL in Germany. There is a vigorous enforcement agency there called GPLviolations.org, headed up by Harald Welter. He is the author of a lot of code and does a lot of enforcement for his own code, but that organization also does enforcement for others as well. This was a company that was selling a media player, and they made a version of the source code available. This is under GPL. They made a version of the source code available, but it wasn't the right corresponding version for the binary. And then when Mr. Velta came and said, "You're infringing my copyright," they said, "But this was what we got from our supplier." Okay, so the court was not convinced by that and said that Fantech had the obligation to figure this out for themselves, that they couldn't merely rely on what their suppliers were doing. An extra element of this case is that this was not the first time the two parties had come together. They had previously been approached for GPL violations, and so this was actually the violation of an agreement that had been in place between the parties before. Maybe the court might have been a little more sympathetic if it was the first time, nobody knows. The point is that this is actually where a lot of people get into trouble. They hire contract manufacturers or contractors to develop something, and they get open source code delivered to them, and sometimes they don't even get the source code, and sometimes they get the wrong source code, and then they have the obligation to deliver up the source code and notices when they're selling the product. And pointing your finger at the supply chain doesn't work. So that's one reason why it's so important to make sure that you're getting the proper information and deliverables from your supply chain, as Michael's going to talk about. By the way, I'll say one more thing before I stop, and that is that I recommend that when my customers hire a developer or a supplier, part of the acceptance process for the product is actually that they make sure they've got all of the open source notices and information and binaries and build instructions, source code and build instructions that they need, and that they don't sign off as an acceptance on the product before they get all those things. If the supplier goes away, you've still got the obligation. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and kick it over to Michael to talk more about supply chain.
Okay, thank you. So following what Heather said, what we're going to focus on was sort of where this is starting to show up more between companies. And the point Heather made that, you know, if you get software or software with hardware from a supplier, I guess the best word we use is you inherit those obligations. In other words, you now own the obligations to the end recipient. And so what we're seeing, we do a lot of work with companies that are both looking at their own products to figure out what's in there, make sure they're compliant with their own products, but also as an entry point when they receive a product from a supplier to make sure that they're getting all the open source compliance artifacts along with that product. So that's kind of an audit on the front end. They still have the burden of carrying that through, but you want to get it from the beginning. And as Heather said, that's negotiating contracts. You're going to get a lot better cooperation than if you wait till the very end for that part of the process. And it is, in these cases like GPL, it's extremely specific. So when you talk about versions, it's down to like the point version, right? If it's a 3-part version number, you have to get down to the exact version. And the people who typically are going to complain, maybe like Mr. Belty or other sort of enthusiasts, are usually technical people, and they're usually pretty precise. So, you know, it's not your average person who's just using a phone. It's someone who has an interest in doing something with the phone or with the device. So what makes sense here, like in lots of cases, is for, you know, the supplier to do their part, and then as you bring your product forward, you have to add your pieces, keep track of what they told you, and then deliver the end product. So what are the 3 key things are, first of all, what's typically called a software bill of materials. Sometimes that's a misnomer, but basically, to make any sense of this, you have to have some list of what's in there. I mean, if you just get a file that says, here's a bunch of lists of programs and the licenses that apply to them. That's not going to help you manage the data. So there's some kind of list, and honestly, it's most frequently delivered in a spreadsheet these days. So the list of things and licenses and huge variability how much detail there's. You need some kind of master packing list, and then what you want from them is the attribution text, the attribution document for the components they're giving you, and if there is copyleft involved, you want them to give you an actual source code redistribution package. So kind of the most salient example of this problem is if you get a Linux distribution, a commercial distribution from Red Hat or Wind River or something like that, the amount of information that's needed to comply with the rules is massive. And those organizations have a big problem to make sure that can be done electronically. They used to deliver 500-page PDF documents that are just, I mean, they're not very easy to use, and they're probably very, very difficult to produce. So we're starting to see more electronic focus. But one of the challenges is if you get this data from your suppliers, and often there are many suppliers, and you're going to get some piece of software you can put in your product. You're going to get it months, maybe years before you use it. You have to figure out, what am I going to do with this data, and how am I going to validate it? So doing the work all over again is not very attractive. But as in the point of the Fantech case, you have to do some reasonable efforts to look at that information and see if it makes sense. And then you need a feedback loop. If the supplier is giving you bad information or bad artifacts, then you want to send those back before you get too far with it.
Could you tell, for instance, how many notices are in the Linux distribution about?
Well, there's different levels. When you get down to the component level, there's thousands of components that are referenced, and sometimes they're like at it's a big piece of code, it's a library. Sometimes they're down within that you can get down to the level of certain files and certain libraries. And attribution compliance is not a zero sum. It's not a 100% game. It's about getting 95% or something like that. But it's a huge amount. Happily, that's usually not the case, right? Most products aren't that big, but those groups are working hard to solve this problem, and those are the kind of things that are going into cars, right? It's a trimmed down version of Linux, but it's Linux.
Can I ask you a question about Red Hat? So Linux is a particularly difficult problem, actually. Last time I looked at Red Hat, what they do is they say you can find all the open source licenses in this directory, and it's pointed to a directory. Mm-hmm. Does that work? I mean,
yeah. Well, there's a couple different models. If you look at ways to deliver attribution, for instance, Firefox actually has a very nice way of presenting it. You go to the About, and it presents it all. Mm-hmm. And they can refer to the source code because they give the source code all the time.
Right.
So actually, Heather brought that up. If you just deliver all the source code with all the notices, I don't think anyone is ever going to give any grief about that. It may not be the easiest thing for an average person to use, but it's certainly compliant. But the problem is once you go to the binaries, once you have various reasons you don't want to deliver all that source code, then you have to sort of think about, how am I going to deliver it, how am I put it together? It's not a case where they're trying to kill you with the detail, but they provide all the details. So typically, one of the things you're paying Red Hat for, instead of using an open source version of Linux, may be that you actually can put pressure on them to give you those artifacts, and you can just pass them through, particularly if you don't modify the kernel, right? That makes sense. So generally, I mean, the kind is pretty simple, but your supplier, if you're a supplier, you're getting open source software packages. Sometimes your developers are going out and getting those. You need a way to track those. And the other key thing that is pretty well known now, but basically, if you're getting software from an ISV, from a commercial entity, generally speaking, with the exception of Microsoft, about half of the software inside that package you're paying for commercially is open source. That's a very rough cut. It can range from 30% to 70%. But you can't ignore that ISV is going to have embedded software, and that they need to give you the software bill of materials and the various artifacts to carry through. And that is really just in the early stages of getting people to do that correctly. But otherwise, you're inheriting that obligation. Now, there is a serious element of risk factors. When we do audits, we produce a list of issues. those are interpreted by legal staff because there are different risks about will everybody be able to figure out that you did it wrong. And you know, the case of the Fantech, that's pretty well-known software, pretty easy for people to detect. But you have to make some judgment call. But in general, you know, you don't want individual developers making that judgment call. You need a policy and approach, and you should be trying to do the right thing because basically then, you know, your odds of being sued or being besides being sued, there's the risk to your reputation. If you're a tech company in particular and you're perceived as not playing by the rules, that can have a negative effect on your staff and just on your general reputation. So in this case, you know, you're going to get some set of information. You're going to do your own software, which is going to embed some open source software. And basically, your customer, whether that's another supplier in the supply chain or your end customer, is going to ask for the same things. So, you know, there's a series of activities that go through a business supply chain, and at the very end, often you have a consumer recipient. And that's often where you see the most people asking for things. If you have a business-to-business relationship, then the recipient is the other business, right? So they're going to be after you to comply because they want it for downstream, but usually, you know, they themselves as a company are not going to sue you for that. They're going to treat it as a commercial relationship. Once you get to the consumer, and the consumer has understanding of software, then, you know, then you've hit the end of the chain. So an element of the solution, I hope many people have heard of, is called SPDX, Software Package Data Exchange. And this is not that new, but about a year and a half old, a little older, but it's an emerging specification for you to communicate to someone else all the details of what's in your software. So it's a pretty complex specification. It basically has so it has, you know, kind of a layering. So there's the SPDX document itself. There's information about who created it. Then there's information about the software packages, the files in the packages, the licensing information, and review information, which is basically who's saying that this is the license. So all this gets to the point that, you know, what is out there on the internet may not be true about the licensing. What's on the website may not be true. The general rule is that the licensing information closest to the code itself is the most correct, but that won't always be the case. So there's lots of interpretation. So within the SPDX format, we're trying to deal with all those levels of who's saying this information, carrying it forward. And it's designed for automation. So there's two formats. One's called RDF, which is like an XML style format, and one's called tag value, just a label and a piece of data. It's kind of a hard way to do things, but there were very strong proponents at the beginning for both approaches, so we had to cover those. What it doesn't do, SPDX does not do in any way, is determine what your data is. It tells you how to exchange it. It has some limitations of how much complexity it can handle. So if I have a product with hundreds of components, it's not going to work really well today. But there is a V2 plan in place for that. So this is kind of the future approach. Well, people have a standard format, you know, I guess vaguely similar to something like EDI, but something that you can export, import, you can supply and consume. But you know, you have a container, but you have to figure out how to track this information. So you're going to get information from, you know, both things you know from your development team, your suppliers, and then there's lots of analysis activities. And we're not going into it in detail, but what we're going to try and talk about is some approaches to actually maintaining this data. Because again, you have to think about, even in rapid development, you're talking months, if not years of time, from when you start working on a product to when you deliver it. And you have to keep track of what's in the product all along the way. So what do you need? Well, basically, our analysis is one of the things you need is a system that can be used in engineering that's pretty flexible, that isn't too tied into one programming language or one programming environment. Most companies are using multiple. You might have a certain set of technologies you use for your GUI or your website, or other technologies used for back-end processing. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. And you want to be able to produce basically these attribution and redistribution packages and, you know, ultimately the SPDX file. So the SPDX file, again, is not the attribution package. It's the way to convey information between between two companies in the supply chain or two organizations in the supply chain. It's not a specification for what goes on the end consumer device. And another big piece of it is you really, and I'm not really talking about that today, but there's a whole other element of enterprise systems. So, there's a level of detail and information that makes sense to keep in the code base. And that's a little different from keeping track of it at an enterprise level. So you need a way for each development team to have very detailed information about the open source software they use. You also need enterprise systems to track it as a whole. That's what our DejaCode Enterprise does, but that's not what we're talking about today. So it's a belt and suspenders approach. You need an approach. So DejaCode explains something we call the About Code tool. So we created a basic specification. It's not any standards body. It's not a consensus like SPDX. But we came up with a simple idea, and this was based on things that we saw being used in the world, the software world. So one example which you can see on the DejaCode website is Android. So the Android ecosystem has a mostly public approach to this, where they put certain files in the code base that give you clues or definitive information about the code base. And most of the Android phone vendors, tablet vendors, use that information to track and generate the notices, which you will see under system information, or I can't remember exactly what it is on the phone. So the idea here is you want to keep it really simple, and the simplest thing is a text file. So what you've got here is a file as an extension called About, and that can be used in any system. So I know we're not talking to a development audience here, but the key point is this is completely agnostic to whatever tools you use or whatever environment. It won't break anything. It's additive to whatever data you have. And it's similar to what many open source projects do. So if you have a piece of software from the Free Software Foundation under the GPL, you can be sure they will have various text files, like the copying file that lists the GPL license and various other notice files in the code. So it's a very standard way of doing things. So this tool is in Python. It's a command line tool, so it's great for developers. It's not particularly end user friendly. It's open source, and the code's on GitHub. The specification is on our site, DejaCode.org. So I'm going to talk a little more about what this does. The idea of this is to get something out there that actually works and get people to use it or to change it and use it in their own environment. But it's something very practical, and there's no cost. I mean, obviously people's time, like open source, but you're not a commercial product saying here's a way that works. You can use it as is, or you can adapt it. So here's an example of what one looks like. This isn't all the fields, but you've got the name of a component, and actually it's not completely trivial to come up with an English or human-readable name, right? The URL of the project, where you can get the code, specific version, date of that version, the license, where the full license text is, the copyright, and the notice. When you're working with attribution in all these areas, there's actually some interesting nuances where you have, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the exact terms, but you've got copyright notice, you've got usually some text that says this notice applies, and then you have the full license itself. So if you look at a license like Apache or GPL, it tells you what to put in your code, which is like a single paragraph, whereas the license is 5 to 8 pages. You don't want to repeat the 5 to 8 pages. So what we're trying to do here is deal with all that the license is Apache 2.0. The license file is the 6 or 7 pages or 5 or 6 pages of the Apache 2.0 license. And then the copyright is the foundation. The notice file tells you the other information about, well, who's saying that it applies. If you're not the copyright owner, then you don't have the right to say what the license is. And it's actually not a trivial problem out there.
Is this a text file?
It's a text file. So this is just a straight text file. It's
text
incorrectly rendered here because there's no tabs in the
right.
file. But yes, it's just a straight text file, and the tools read the labels and look at the data. And there's quite a bit of validation, and you have to understand what's a URL and what are the rules on that. The spec explains where we got the information from. So what do the tools do? Well, you got to start somewhere. But basically, what it can do is you can create these files. So assuming you have a spreadsheet, because that's what most people have, you can create a set of these files to insert into your code base that has whatever information you have. I mean, it's open and, it doesn't have a lot of mandatory rules saying you must have this for the program to run. But it takes the data you have, you get in a spreadsheet format, you can insert it, you create these files, put them in your code base. Conversely, if you've got those in your code base, you can, on demand, just produce a software bill of materials for someone who asks. So that might be to share with a customer, might be some internal process. You can create the attribution text from the data. Typically, what we're finding is a very, very simple HTML format seems to work really well for people because you can save that as a document, you can save that with HTML, you can save that as text. We can create a source code redistribution package list. This is not actually creating the package. There's a couple steps, at a development level, but it can give you like a packing list of what you need to provide. So those are all the functions that we have today. And so here's the basic idea that, so I have to start somewhere. It's a chicken and the egg problem. But somewhere I have a baseline of what's in my product. And out of that, I have a bill of materials or an inventory of that software. And I should have collected my license text. And if I have all that, I insert them into the code base for release 1. During that period, I'm updating these files. Now, that involves some process on your side, but it's very feasible to do this in a simple way. You edit the files, you add files. Now I have my release 2 code base. I can generate a new inventory compared to the release 1. I can generate this attribution document. When I say display, again, if you do an HTML, you can insert a link somewhere in your UI, and the package list. So it's just the cycle. Then the next cycle, this release 2 is the input. But now I have the component license text. I have the data in the code base. So I can keep regenerating these packages as I need to. So that's the idea of a virtuous cycle, that you get started somewhere, you do the incremental changes, and then you repeat the process per release.
So can I ask you a question? If I'm putting a product together, and I say to all my vendors, I want you to deliver to me open source code only if it has one of these about files in it. How do you think a supplier would respond to that? Would they say, that's really onerous, we don't want to do that, or sure, why not, it's a few hours, we don't care?
Well, it's an interesting problem. So the SPDX group is dealing with that same issue, and it's come a long way that people are actually starting to use it. And the resistance on the SPDX, besides being a new thing, is that it's a pretty detailed document you have to produce. So there's some resistance, but we see things going forward. And we will integrate with that at some point. On the about files, the resistance you might get is it's not a community consensus-based standard, so what's going to change. But I think one of the keys is sometimes been called SPDX Lite, that you need to have a lighter weight approach. So I don't know exactly how they'd respond, but it's not asking for a lot. It presumably would help them. It doesn't solve the question of figuring out what's in there, what's in the code, but why not document the code? So there's a lot of theories about this. There's other systems, our DejaCode Enterprise will track this data. But the problem is if it's not close to developers, it has no chance of being updated. If it's on a corporate system where they have to remember to go and update it, it's just not going to happen. I mean, you can talk as long as you want. Now, how people would integrate it in here, the idea would be you'd integrate it into each development team. So they might have a slightly different approach depending on what part of development they do. But it's a general approach, and you can share the output. But I think it is a curve, but they would, I guess the idea of the supplier would be that they see the same benefits you do. In other words, if they're doing it in spreadsheets, they're constantly having trouble.
Why not do it in that
Right, and if they have certain discerning customers, like some of our customers, who will throw it back at them if it's incorrect, then they've got the problem of how am I going to keep it correct? So I guess in particular, if the customers push back, that's what's going to incent them to do it. So I've been talking about this, but basically, there's some nuances. If you get an attribution text file, one of the things you get this from a supplier and you add it to your code base, you still need to do some work. Like you need to figure out what do I actually ship. I may not ship everything, therefore not all the attribution text may be completely applicable. And we have not solved the source code redistribution package scenario. That gets to be very specific to the environment. But knowing what you have to redistribute, having a discrete, I mean, somebody could say, okay, I can go read the licenses, I can go do this. No, it's a concrete list of what needs to be redistributed And then, as Heather mentioned, for certain licenses, you still have to make sure it can compile. There's certain other steps. But having a concrete list, which is a subset of all your open sources, is very valuable. And we've anticipated some advanced automation, and we have some customers we're working with on this, such that you can recognize these files in the code base. So build systems for developers can be very complex and very idiosyncratic. But once you have the data in the code base, you can use it to automate the process even more. So you could flag an item that you want to make sure I never distribute it because of its license. I use it under license. It's okay for internal use. I use it under GPL 3.0. I'm okay with that internal, but I never want to ship that. I could have a flag, and the build system could flag that as an error. It could do more automation to actually, create that attribution text file and do the extra steps so that it's in the right code directory, so that when you launch the GUI, it's automatically there. So the idea of the system is to be extensible, and that would again be down to the product development team level. What you want to keep is this kind of generally simple primary approach, so that the data is all readable and can be organized across all the teams in the same format. And then the actual deliverables would depend on the product, how the product's delivered, what the development team wants to do. But our idea is, get something basic, something that works and is extensible is better than, a grand scheme. Eventually, this will merge with the SPDX approach. But again, the SPDX is transferring documents at the enterprise level, right? It's not, it's not in the code per se, and it's probably not at a level that developers will be too enthusiastic about maintaining, even though we're trying to foster that. We've had quite a bit of resistance. So these are, basically we've got three things going. We've got the code on GitHub, downloadable, usable today. It does require some familiarity with Python for a developer, but it shouldn't be too hard. And we published the spec, and we have a discussion forum going on DejaCode.org. So we use it ourselves. We're working on it with some customers. It's fairly new, but it is concrete and real. And what we're trying to get across here today is that there are practical, relatively simple solutions to this, but it requires a commitment to actually, getting the data in the first place and then maintaining the data. If you don't do that, it's like, it's a Sisyphean enterprise. You're constantly doing it over and over again. What we do see is a lot of people that are constantly sort of analyzing the same code base because it's a new release. They didn't keep track of what was going on between release 1 and release 2. They end up with pretty much the same level of expense relative to what their policy and their compliance approach is to do this on the next release. We'll see how it plays out in the long run. But the idea today was to say this: you're going to need a lot of tools in the supply chain to manage this flow of information. But one of them has got to be at the engineering level, and this is a key area where an open source solution makes sense. And then that has to synchronize also with a broader system. Again, at some level across your enterprise, you need to track this. If you have 100, if you only have one product or two products, a small company, this is all you will need. If you've got 100 or 200 or 300 products, then you're going to have other systems like DejaCode Enterprise to manage the data. But then they can receive the data from this system. But the code and the information in the code is primary. If it's not with the code, it's not going to be up to date. And you're not going to be able to process it because you'll have a disconnect between someone thinking of this abstractly and the developers who, one way or another, someone knows what they're actually using, what version of the code they're using, what actually goes into their end product versus what stays in their development environment. Those are all things that happen in the engineering side, and you have to get that group engaged with tracking it at some basic level. So does that make sense? I know it's not a technical audience. We're trying to keep it fairly high level, but the idea is to get across that there are solutions out there that work, that exist, that you can start implementing at the engineering level while you work also on the policy and the enterprise data level. Questions, or do we have questions?
Yeah, there are 3 questions.
Okay. Is there a difference between selling and giving in open source? Not really.
No, there's really no difference. The question is whether you have distributed,
right,
and that can be either for a fee or not for a fee. Actually, open source licenses are agnostic about whether you can charge a fee. It may be difficult to charge a fee if they can get the software somewhere else free of charge, but the question the act that triggers the copyleft conditions and the attribution and notice requirements for most licenses is distribution, which can be for money or not for money.
Yeah. So the next question was, in an attribution notice, is it sufficient to say, quote, portions of the software is governed by XYZ open source license, e.g. Apache version 2.0, or do you need to be specific about the applicable component? That's a good question. Actually, it varies quite a bit. So some products, some projects will give you a very short and succinct attribution statement. JPEG and a few others in particular saying all you have to say is this product contains software from the JPEG organization. So if you have a specific clause that tells you how you can do it, then it is sufficient. But it's not generally a decision you get to make. The second part about...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll probably add something, and I hope I'm not stepping on your toes. But even though sometimes you can do things in a shorthand manner, it's sometimes way more work to figure out that you can do them in a shorthand manner than to just do them in the longhand manner. If you've got hundreds or thousands of components to deal with, then it's easier to just go through and dump all the notices in one place than it is to figure out if you can exclude some.
Right.
And in fact, I'll answer a question that wasn't asked, which is, what if I put in some notices for software that's not really in my product? Because sometimes it's more expensive to figure out what to remove because it's not really there. Say you did a build and you excluded this component, and my answer is generally over-noticing is not a problem, except to the extent that someone might ask you for code that you're not using. Right. But it's not a violation of the license. So sometimes there are things you can do, and it makes a lot of sense if you've got 10 components. But if you've got hundreds of components, it may just be more expensive to figure out that you can do something easier than to just do the harder thing.
Well, there's another thing that's kind of lost in this, which is if you think about what do open source developers asking for with attribution? They're asking for credit. So very often you'll see people say, Apache is a weird case for Apache projects because it is always the same author. By definition, it's the Apache Software Foundation. So there's not a lot of variability there. But if you start talking about licenses like Apache or GPL for other projects, what developers are asking for in attribution is credit. That means you got to have their name. If you just say it's under this license and you don't explain who the authors are, you're not complying in principle. That's very important. So often you'll see a notice that says the following packages under GPL and no mention of who the authors are. Well, that's not up to snuff. Again, it may not land you in direct legal trouble, but you're supposed to say who the authors are. That was the whole purpose of this exercise. Now, there's lots of ways to do that. So one of the things we do in our practice is we do lots of summarization, what we call composite licenses. And certain open source projects like WebKit and DropBear and others do this, where they provide a summary notice for the whole package. And that's very convenient, because if you have 20 authors, for whatever reason, it's really painful to go down and work at that lower level. So, you'll often see this, and you see this more commonly in projects where they will have sort of a composite, maybe one license and many authors and dates. It may be a handful of licenses. It works particularly well in licenses that are called attribution style, the MITs, the BSCs, where there aren't specific copyleft obligations because they're just kind of nuances of what you want. But as Heather said, if you don't go down to the level of detail, you can't track it. And then if you start trying to use an alternate notice, you end up with a, kind of a logic loop you got to constantly check. So we do advise people just reproduce. If you're going to reproduce something about JPEG, go ahead and reproduce it all. It doesn't cost you any more. The last point, that was designed, I think, at one time when GUIs were very small and they didn't have much space to do things. If an OSS vendor has inherited Apache 2.0 code, would like to license their code with GPL, are there compliance issues? There are compatibility issues between the licenses. So the problem is if the licenses don't comply, you can't really combine the two, right? It's just you create a license conflict. Now, those exist out there in the world and again, are not subject to frequent lawsuits. But in principle, if you're going with GPL, the Free Software Foundation tells you what the compatible licenses are, and my recollection is Apache 2.0 is not compatible.
Yeah, there's actually a difference of opinion between the Free Software Foundation and the Apache Foundation.
Right. Okay.
The Free Software Foundation thinks that Apache is not compatible with GPL. In other words, you can't take Apache 2 code and put it in a GPL project and relicense it under GPL. Apache Foundation, as far as I can tell, thinks you can, although they have removed some of the discussion of that from their website. This was all resolved in the sense that Apache 2 is compatible with GPL 3. The problem is that many, many projects didn't move to GPL 3. And so there's at least a theoretical conflict between Apache 2 and GPL. Now, that having been said, I've never seen any enforcement on that issue. So,
and potentially you could carve it out, right? You could carve out continue a certain code under Apache 2.0 and
you could, but if you're really integrating it into the GPL code, then that might be seen as violating GPL. I mean, it's an interesting question, but there are probably many, many things to do for your compliance strategy before you get to that one.
Can you get around that by dual licensing in both Apache and GPL2?
Well, no, you cannot get around it by dual licensing because the GPL code cannot be relicensed under Apache. Because GPL is a copyleft license, so it can only be.
But if you're developing an open source component from scratch.
Oh, if you're developing from scratch, you can use whatever cockamamie licensing terms you like. Actually, dual licensing under Apache 2 and GPL makes some sense because of this theoretical incompatibility. Right. What doesn't particularly make sense is dual licensing under MIT and GPL, but there are hundreds of projects that are like that. The answer to that is it just needs to be MIT because then you can take that and put it in.
Well, there are some interesting sort of compatibility questions. So there's many projects where they offer multiple licenses so that you can align with whatever your preferred one is. But there's this kind of funny one that's out there like dual GPL MIT.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
One of the things that's funny about it is if you want to incorporate MIT code in a GPL project, that's fine. You don't have a problem, right? So if you really just put that under MIT anyway, it can go into any GPL project you want, so it's not a need for 2 licenses. But it isn't getting through. One of the interesting developments way up the supply chain in the last week, I think, was at GitHub, this site where we have our project that's become super popular for developers, and I don't know, they got $100 million, so they just launched an initiative to actually prompt developers to put a license on their code because they're having so much trouble that there was no license. And in a commercial context, no license doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It means you have no license. So there's actually, and there's an interesting site on that we can share with people that they've kind of come up with their own little, little walkthrough, a little checklist of how to go through it. Mm-hmm. And it's a reasonable assumption that the reason a lot of projects don't have licenses is that people just don't know what to do, so they just skip it, and then what they end up is a situation where people can't use their code, but their purpose on putting it on GitHub was that people would use it. So it helps to be explicit.
Yeah, it's a really great, I mean, I really applaud them for doing that because it helps with clarity, and they've done it in a way that is very agnostic, right? Because part of the reason I think that there hasn't been robust information about how to choose a license for your project is that they're just like warring camps about the licenses, so people didn't have an interest in providing a sort of neutral choice information, so they did that, and it's really great. Definitely something worth checking out. I really like the way they approached it.
Yeah, we do a lot of analysis work, and sometimes we end up, we'll see a license, particularly one that one of our customers is not too happy with, and very often we'll contact the developer, and they didn't actually intend that license. They typo. A classic one about the links is that people put on their website a link to the Free Software Foundation, and that means if that's all they did, it wasn't in their code. When the Free Software Foundation changed that link from GPL 2 to 3, they changed their license.
Right.
But that wasn't what they intended. So, you have to. It's really good to be succinct but specific. Another question: how do you see products like Black Duck or Palamida in organizing open source code? Well, those are competitors. They have solutions for that. The important thing is to have an enterprise view that looks across products. In addition to that, they're not addressing the issue of what's in the code itself, which is what the About Code tool is designed for.
Well, so I think we're out of time now. One thing, I got a couple of emails during the presentation that people had trouble seeing the slides who are on the webinar. We can provide copies of the slides. In fact, you should get an email follow-up if you have signed up, if you were signed up for the webinar, that will show you how to get a copy of the slides. So you'll get that. You don't have to do anything. Also, anybody who's interested in CLE credit, you'll get a communication about that too. So it might not come immediately, but it will come to you, and so you can get your CLE credit, get a copy of the slides. I believe they've also recorded the presentation. So you can also, you know, if you want to relive this exciting event here, you can do that as well, or share it with your colleagues. So we will be around here for a while and happy to answer questions. Wanted to thank everybody who's here in person today and all the webinar attendees. I'd like to thank Michael.
45.
45 attendees, that's great. I'd like to thank Pierre, and I apologize for characterizing his role, except that you know, maybe you've gotten a promotion, and I'm expecting my payoff. But thank you, Pierre, for helping us monitor the questions. And we look forward to seeing you again when we do another presentation. So thank you very much.